Hi everyone. My name's Jennifer Keohane and I'm so excited to welcome you to our conference. I've exchanged emails with many of you and I'm very sorry to say that I won't be able to meet you in person as a pressing family commitment is taking me away from Arlington this weekend. I really sincerely hope that you have a wonderful conference and enjoy the chance to meet folks with similar research interests. I'm really excited to take just a couple minutes here to tell you a little bit about my research interests and how they relate to character assassination. So I'm going to talk just quickly about my ongoing research about rhetoric's contributions to understanding character assassination, and I hope some of the questions that I'll raise at the end of my presentation today are useful for guiding some of the conversations that will continue to occur at the conference. So thank you for being here, and I'm excited to chat with you a little bit this morning. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about something interesting that I've noticed, which is primarily that character assassination, at least under those terms, has been studied largely in fields like political psychology, public relations, and history. Nonetheless, though, rhetoricians and scholars of argumentation have identified concepts that I think really fundamentally help us understand character assassination in all of its various forms. So those two concepts that I'll unpack a little bit throughout the rest of my presentation include ad hominem attacks, which are often considered logical fallacies, and the enduring conception of ethos, which has fascinated rhetoricians for many years. I'll take these in reverse order quickly. So ethos is one of Aristotle's three persuasive appeals. So in the Rhetoric, Aristotle identifies ethos, pathos, and logos as the three fundamental modes of persuasion. Many of you may remember this all the way back if you've taken foundations of communication courses or even public speaking. So pathos is typically understood as the way the speaker appeals to emotion using imagination and sympathy, perhaps. By contrast, logos is about appealing to reason and using logic and rationality. Ethos, however, is a question of credibility, a question of the speaker's ability to build a confident, authoritative character that they present to the audience. So fundamentally, although ethos isn't the same thing as character, is certainly related and can, I think, help us get at how character assassination works a little bit. I also mentioned ad hominem attacks. So here's one of my favorite little pictures to use when I teach argumentation to undergraduates. Here we have our logical fallacy referee. He's thrown a flag on this particular play because the speaker, or in this case the blogger, has used an ad hominem fallacy or illegally substituted an attack on the person for refuting an argument. And finally, to take an example from political discourse, here we have Donald Trump tweeting in April of 2015, "If Hillary Clinton can't satisfy her husband, what makes her think she can satisfy America?" For what it's worth, I guess I should clarify, Trump is retweeting someone when he's saying this. But here we see the classic ad hominem attack, right? Instead of engaging Hillary Clinton on policy platforms, we have an attack on her femininity and her ability to carry out wifely duties, right? So shifting the focus of the debate. So to unpack ad hominem a little bit more, obviously we remember, based on what I just told you, ad hominem attacks are using personal attacks instead of responding to the arguments laid out in a debate. Ad hominem means against the man, so arguing against someone's personal character instead of engaging in a substantive issue debate. The traditional treatment of ad hominem attacks is to treat them as logical fallacies and place them on traditional lists of fallacies and instruct students not to use them. So those traditional lists include things like ad baculum, an appeal to fear, ad populum, a bandwagon appeal. So in general, ad hominem gets lumped in with these other errors in reasoning. Yap, an argumentation scholar, identifies ad hominem as a fallacy of relevance because it's shifting the focus of the debate from something that might be seen as not relevant to a substantive policy debate. But what I want us to pull away from that argument is the recognition that thinking about ad hominem attacks in this particular manner situates them in Aristotle's mode of logos, right? Thinking about them as errors in logical reasoning. New scholarship on ad hominem attacks, however, encourage us to think about them a little bit differently. So Britton suggests that instead of thinking about ad hominem arguments as logical or falling under logic, that maybe we should consider ethos or credibility instead. Now, rhetoricians have waffled a little bit about whether ethos refers to the actual tried and true character of a speaker, sort of their fundamental personality, or the impression that the speaker leaves on the audience, right? So is it a personality trait, or is it something that's created and performed in discourse? And of course, that raises the question of how is it that we measure someone's actual character, which is a challenge and something that we should continue thinking about as we think about character assassination. In response to this challenge, rhetoricians have brought forth several different conceptions of ethos that help them understand character and credibility in persuasive messages. Prior ethos refers to the speaker's prior reputation and track record that's known to the audience before the persuasive message is begun, right? So prior characteristics known and understood by the audience. Intrinsic ethos refers to the image of the speaker that's generated or created in the speech. How does the speaker perform their credibility? And this can be created by using things like appropriate evidence. It's a great way to build credibility, as I tell my students in public speaking. The last concept of ethos is one that I created in the course of a research project that I'll tell you about in a second. But procedural ethos refers to following the appropriate procedure regarding how and when a speaker should speak or circulate a persuasive message. And I'll tell you why I created that concept and what I think it gets us as we study character assassination in 1 second. But one of the things that rhetoricians are continually focused on is the audience, right? It returns us to the question of audience, who is the ultimate arbiter of character. And I suggest it helps us understand where character comes from in the first place. Now, thinking about ad hominem attack in this new manner as a mode of ethos instead of as logos requires us to think through a couple of other related challenges. So it prompts the question, are there times when attacks on a speaker's character are not only acceptable, but justified? In other words, are ad hominem fallacies not actually fallacies? Because ethos is a fundamental component of the rhetorical act. Now, Brinton suggests that when we have to rely on the authority of the arguer in deciding whether or not to accept the premises of their argument, and when assumptions embedded in the argument require listeners to weigh credentials or motivation of the speaker, that in these two instances, ad hominem attacks, or an attack on the speaker's character, are acceptable and maybe even justified. So the tried and true example of this is a political candidate campaigning on a platform of family values who is a cheating and lying bad person, right? So the contradiction there, when they go out and make arguments about family values, it seems relevant, acceptable, and justified for the audience to know that they don't live up to those values. So again, this requires us to rethink ad hominem as not a logical fallacy, but as a fundamental and important part of political discourse. And again, I think that's important. All of this then led me to think that there's something really significant that rhetoric can offer to people understanding and wanting to study character assassination. And primarily, those contributions come along the lines of some of the scholarship that I've already summarized for you. But primarily, ethos allows us to understand, I think, why some character attacks stick or work and others fail. You may be wondering why there's a picture of journalist Edward R. Murrow on the side of the screen here. My thinking about ethos and character assassination stemmed out of a project that I was doing about Edward R. Murrow and an exchange he had with Senator Joseph McCarthy during the early Cold War. Murrow presented on his news program a scathing attack on McCarthy for his zealous, vitriolic methods of rooting communists out of government. He invited McCarthy to respond on the program. And when McCarthy accepted the invitation, the news ignored McCarthy's response, while Murrow was praised to high heaven for having the courage to take on Senator McCarthy. And so I was thinking through, why is it that Murrow was so successful in launching his character attack, whereas McCarthy's defense ultimately fell flat? And the argument that I came to is that fundamentally the character of the attacker matters a great deal as well. And the attacker builds that character through the rhetoric that they use to launch the attack, right? So throughout his attack on McCarthy, Murrow appears measured, scholarly, erudite. Whereas when McCarthy responded, the character he created within that response was of an unhinged madman. So the character of the attacker matters a great deal as they build character attacks. And understanding the prior intrinsic and procedural ethos helps us understand that as well, right? So Murrow was known as a trusted source of news in the United States. And intrinsically within his report, he also appeared to be just as trustworthy and careful and thoughtful, while following appropriate procedural standards for evidence. The last concept I'll call our attention to is kairos, or the understanding of the right time to launch the attack. Simply put, McCarthy waited much too long in order to respond to Murrow, and as a result, Murrow's attacks stuck, while McCarthy's response and subsequent attack on Murrow didn't work at all. The last thing I want us to think about, questions that came out of studying this exchange that I think are relevant to probably much of our research. Do the ends justify the means? Is it okay to attack an incessant, intense demagogue like McCarthy? The last thing is a question that specifically animates a great deal of rhetoric scholarship. Rhetoricians are always interested in who is the audience that's created by rhetoric, who is called forth to be the audience. So who's the audience created by character attacks? Jeremy Ingalls identifies a rhetoric of anxiety that comes out of the United States' long history of political attack. And Edward R. Murrow worried about McCarthy's power because it led us to walk in fear of one another. And in some ways, I wonder the same thing, right? Does an incessant political climate constituted primarily by attack lead to us walking in fear of one another And what are the implications of that if I have in fact diagnosed character attacks as rhetoric effectively? So thank you for listening to my brief presentation of where my research is going these days. I'm sorry I'm not around to take your questions, but I hope that you'll enjoy the conversation for the rest of the weekend. Thank you.